Okay, very good. Glenn, what happened to your electricity?
Sorry?
No, I'm asking
electricity.
Matt said that his electricity was taken down by hackers or what? What's going on?
Oh, I don't know. It just happened literally five minutes before this began. The entire building went down. So I don't know. I have no idea. I don't think it's connected.
Okay. Well, let's not waste time. Again, we are in very difficult historical time. And if you're watching the media, both US, American, and Western media, and Russian, this word nuclear comes, pretty often. And it's also symbolic that we are now joined by students of the nuclear university in Moscow. It's probably some kind of a historical, someone just put us together this morning. It's, by the way, it's evening in Moscow. It's 6 p.m. So let's do this. Since you started this, it was your idea to have this discussion. And actually, you helped to bring all this group together, and I helped to bring my students. Why don't you start with some introduction? Each of us, I think we have what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 American speakers, or Western. Matt is from Canada, and of course Glenn is from Norway. So we have pretty international group here. Anton, where are you based now?
I'm in Northern Virginia, near Washington.
Okay, not too far from here. Okay, so Matt, why don't you start?
Well, actually, Ed, just because there's going to be students continuously trickling in for the next 10 minutes or so, that's always the way it works, and I have to continuously let people in. Why don't you ask one of the other speakers, and I'll go second or third.
Okay, anyone maybe wants to start this discussion?
Yeah,
Sure.
Okay, Anton, please go ahead.
I have a prepared statement.
Okay.
It says what exactly I want to say. The world's safety requires Russia and China to defend their sovereign existence. But America's rulers seem willing to destroy civilization to try to force their surrender. Our highest priority must be to change America's course. Criticism or protest ought to be effective in actually changing the USA. Americans need to be profoundly moved for them to interfere against the Anglo-American policy. Don't assume that Americans cannot be moved. That would abandon our loved ones to hell. We've got to deepen our thinking on how to accomplish the change, how to powerfully appeal to Americans. Now, Russian leaders always invoke Russia's real history to rally their people. But America's present establishment cannot use our real history to justify their policy, because our real history indicts them and exposes them as usurpers. That Anglo-American financier establishment catastrophically changed and ruined the United States. They erased from public memory America's historic purpose and miraculous past accomplishments. That establishment is the historic imperial enemy of our country. Their philosophy and their objectives go back to the British Empire and its partners, the Southern slave owners. From the founding of the USA, the empire and the slave owners blocked and sabotaged America's development of modern science, industry, and skills. It was pro-national patriots who defied that imperial enemy and organized our country's great industrial and scientific advances. Those nation builders also built up the industry and independence of other nations resisting imperialism. And those American builders were the truthful critics of America's own faults and crimes. I have time here for only the briefest summary of this story, which is otherwise in my book, Who We Are. Consider two US presidents in the 19th century, John Quincy Adams and Abraham Lincoln, and two in the 20th century, Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy. John Quincy Adams led the faction that organized the first industrialization of the United States. He assigned Army engineers to design America's first railroads. One of those engineers built Russia's first railroad, in line with Adams' old vision of industrializing Russia. Adams bravely fought against slavery, and he thought the betrayal of the American Indians was a sin for which God would judge America. Abraham Lincoln and his closest allies organized the greatest industrial progress in world history. Defying Wall Street, they built America's modern steel mills, railroads, petroleum, and electrical industries. Russia freed its own slaves the day before Lincoln's inauguration. Russia sent its naval fleets to America, supporting Lincoln's fight to end slavery. Franklin Roosevelt rescued us from the depression caused by Wall Street and London, and with Russia, defeated the Nazis who had been built up by Wall Street and London. FDR brought electricity to Americans whom Wall Street had blocked from getting it. He fought to overturn imperialism, to build up man's power over nature, and to end colonial sector poverty. FDR insisted that the USA and Russia, as partners, must together guarantee the world's future peace. John Kennedy gained fame as a senator by opposing European imperialism. He attacked American reactionaries who betrayed our revolutionary founders and lined us up with imperialism. President Kennedy worked for world cooperation in nuclear energy, space exploration, and Africa's electrification. He blocked the plunge toward nuclear war. JFK's plea for cooperation with Russia brought him fatal hatred from the pro-imperial faction in the CIA and Pentagon. The question ought to be put to the American people. Should this faction, who murdered our last great president, be allowed to rule us, take down our industries, erase our past accomplishments from history, and drag us into a nuclear holocaust? I want to close with words from President Kennedy's famous speech on peace with Russia, June 10th, 1963. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, and in acts of courage. Our two countries, Kennedy said, have a mutual abhorrence of war. We have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union suffered in the course of the Second World War. Kennedy warned that if these two strongest countries now fought in total war, all we have built, all we have worked for, would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. He decried the waste of the arms race and said we must prohibit the testing of nuclear weapons. And he appealed to American souls for peace with Russia. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. We all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal.
Thank you, Anton. Pretty powerful statement. And as it happens, one of our speakers today is a professor of history of American University, where I actually used to teach as well. There's a statement from the location where Kennedy gave the speech, and this is where Peter Kuznick right now, and he can follow up with maybe what you said and what Kennedy thought. Peter, go ahead. You need unmute yourself. Peter, unmute.
I'm sorry, I'm unmuted.
Okay.
I was trying to say that I'd like to wait a few minutes and hear what other people have to say. I've been doing a lot of interviews and haven't had a minute to think of what I want to say.
Okay. Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, I think you can do that because I believe Herbert Reginbogin, who is our colleague from Catholic University of America, may respond to Anton, and then we can come back to you. I thought simply to have a bridge from what Anton said to American University in Kennedy. So Herbert, go again. Let's again, Herbert Reginbogin, he's professor at the Catholic University of America, also here in Washington, D.C. And then we'll come back to Peter. Herb, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be among you. I am a fellow and continue to have a role as a professor at different universities in the transatlantic relation. And just to comment on an academic level about what was previously presented. Michael Gaylor, 2 volumes called Empire. And my book, Hitler, der Westen und die Schweiz, which is Hitler, the West and Switzerland, which takes a very steep analysis of the industrial complex between American and European interests. And of course, they are charged with circumventing the laws in the United States called trading with the enemy. And however, to disconnect from the idea that they were hooligans that controlled the American government interests instead of that of its people, it is proven without a doubt that that is wrong, because the primary resources used to prove that the Justice Department had done an enormous job in bringing justice to these traitors, to these criminals in violation of this very important law, continued for many years through sequestering their assets and putting them into prisons. This is an entailment of detail that needs to be critically reviewed in terms of what was presented. Furthermore, Bay of Pigs is on Kennedy's agenda. And that is not about accepting, that is about coercion, that is about the violation of international law. And that's another paradox. So the theme here, what I'm about to discuss on Ukraine, is about cooperation and conflict. Cooperation and conflict is a paradox in state interests. It's about the hypocrisy of not supporting human rights here, but turning a blind eye because we have interest. Best case, Khashoggi in Saudi Arabia, killing him, an American resident journalist, in the embassy of Turkey or in the consulate of Turkey in Istanbul. So to come to Ukraine, there are 3 important areas. One, will Ukraine become permanently divided? or will it become permanently neutral? And moreover, will it become an occupied country? These are the three most important issues facing currently Ukraine. And in this respect, what can the United States, the West, do in providing an off-ramp for its Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, who is now in dire straits of escalating the war because of the Ukrainian resistance. Every day this goes on, the leader of Russia has not really a way to save face. There's no off-ramp. And moreover, he is now atoning, or at least he is being charged with war crimes. This is Russia's image. And this is the self-image. And unlike China or Russia, the United States has public discourse. It does not have the censorship. It does not put people in prison for demonstrating on the streets. And if racism is to be something forgotten or something that is charged with the United States, then I would remind everyone, because of their ideal personalities or individuals, ask the question, would they allow their daughter to marry a Black person at that time? Would they allow a Jew to convert to Christianity and then the Jews would still love the children who did that? These are the moral aspects of tolerance. This is jumping beyond the paradigm. And that brings us to the question of Ukraine. Ukraine has been offered, and it's in its constitution currently, that it has NATO aspiration. That was changed in the laws 2 months before Zelensky became president. And what does the West do? Does the West still use it as a teaser of not really saying honestly, as an honest broker, look, it's unreasonable that you're going to achieve this maybe in the 10, 20 years. Not because of us only, because we have 30 people who think this will bring us into a war and release or engage Article 5, which is collective security response or invasion. The point that I'm trying to make is that the proponents of criticizing the West have good reason. And there's really a good reason, because the West was blindsided. And they had no idea of what was happening, at least in the general response. And the problem here is, why didn't the intellectual community of Russia engage with those Western, specifically American academics, in talking about neutrality and neutralization? Because the American scholars have been talking about this for years. So again, it's blindsided in academia and it's blindsided in policymaking. And so the illusions, the disconnect in the communication, the examples that we ramble through history, don't give us really founded understanding of how we can accommodate each other's understanding of security, which this is the security dilemma, and still, and this is the most important part, respect the sovereignty of Ukraine, the principle that that nation has the right to choose. Because we do live in a global 21st century, which is supposedly disenfranchise us from the 2 world wars and all the causes related, which is all about power politics. And it's not to be naive that the idea of spreading democracy is the solution. It's a combination of human dignity and the respect for each other. And that should be the starting point. Thank you.
Thank you, Herb. Good point. Before, I don't want to interrupt, with my comments, maybe I'll do it at the end, because I have a few issues which you raised, and actually with Anton as well. But let's have everyone have a chance to say something, and then we can follow up. Now back to American University and John Kennedy and Peter Kuznick.
I wish we could get back to John Kennedy. I'd even wish we could get back to Nikita Khrushchev. I'd love to have Mikhail Gorbachev. I'm not very happy with Vladimir Putin at the moment. I mean, I'm mostly here today to listen because I'm at my wit's end in terms of trying to make sense of what's happening and where we go from here. As some of you know, for the past 3 months, I probably did 75 or more appearances on Russian TV. And my message throughout was that I understand and appreciate Russia's legitimate national security concerns, that I've watched 30 years plus of the United States and NATO trampling over Russia's interests, ignoring Russia's interests, despite the fact that Russia wanted to be friends with the United States initially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Putin was the first international leader to call George Bush and offer aid after 9/11, and that the US responded to that in 2002 by abrogating the ABM Treaty, 2003, invading Iraq, 2004, expanding NATO 7 more countries to Russia's borders. You know, I've been talking about this for a long time, and also about Putin's warnings. You know, this should not be a surprise. 2007, his Munich speech denouncing American unipolarity, denouncing American hypermilitarism, denouncing NATO expansion, and then 2008 are ignoring it. Just to finish with that theme, in 2018, in Putin's State of the Nation address, March 1st, 2018, when he announces that Russia has 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which can circumvent US missile defense, he says, "You didn't listen to us now." And we did not listen again. And we, in part, see the consequences of that, as awful as it is. So there's lots of hypocrisy. You turn on American media and they're all up in arms. They've got all these moral concerns. The same people in the same stations that cheerled the invasion of Afghanistan, cheerled the invasion of Iraq, cheerled the invasion of Libya, the bombing of Syria. So we know that we're up against something. And when I listen to them now about the biggest war in Europe, yeah, it's the biggest war in Europe, but they have to say that because they don't want to talk about the US wars, which were much bigger and more devastating than, at least than what we've seen so far. When I look at it now, I mean, my message over all that time to Putin was, you've achieved your goals, you've won. The West is making compromises on certain things, missiles, war games. The world is talking about your legitimate national security concerns. This is the time to pull the troops back from the border, declare victory, and begin serious diplomacy. The invasion caught me and caught most of us, I think, completely off guard. We were criticizing media alarmism in the US, and we're criticizing Biden's and others' alarmism. And by the way, I talked about Putin's promises not to invade, and we found out that was a lie. Putin's speeches this past week, right before the invasion, struck me as deranged. I'm curious to hear if others thought he was as unhinged as I think he was. The kind of anger, Putin is always this cold, calculating, rational, risk-averse person, and then he sounded like a completely different person. People are trying to make sense of it. Is it because he's been isolated for 2 years? Is it because he's only surrounded by yes men who egg him on with this? Is he totally unconnected to reality at this point? Is it the madman thesis? He learned from Richard Nixon that if you act like a crazy person, then the world is going to be afraid of you and they're not going to provoke you. It didn't work for Nixon in Vietnam. Maybe it's going to work for Putin now. In any case, we're at a really important, dangerous turning point in history, because this could escalate into, right now, it's already a breach of international law. It's already a moral outrage, but it can turn into a bloodbath, a catastrophic bloodbath of a scale that we haven't seen since some of the US bloodbaths, or possibly even worse. So I do my interviews. I was on Indian television yesterday, and and I'm trying to find people who are not so tied that they could possibly intervene, who Putin will listen to. So I was appealing to Modi to try to intervene, but today I'm doing Tehran, the Tehran Times, and that's a different issue with Iran. But tomorrow morning I'm on Chinese TV. And one person who I see who might have the ability to talk to both sides is Xi Jinping. Macron tried, in some ways valiantly, but failed. Xi Jinping has recognized Ukraine's sovereignty. They've got very heavy economic investment in Ukraine, the Chinese do. The Belt and Road Initiative is very much involved in Ukraine. Xi Jinping is also very close to Putin. He says Putin's his dearest friend in the world. Xi Jinping has said that he agrees with Russia about NATO encroachment. Maybe I'm going to appeal to him tomorrow to try to get him to move much more aggressively, because we're still at a point with that column of tanks and armaments moving toward Kiev, 40 miles long. We're still at a point where the worst of this catastrophe can be prevented before it happens. I'm not sure what we're supposed to do at this point. I was talking with my students the other day about the Japanese movie Black Rain, the 1991 film about Hiroshima that won the Academy Awards in Japan, in which one of the protagonists comments, he's an atomic bomb survivor. This was 5 years later, and he says, an unjust peace is better than a just war. And I think we've got to figure out how we as an international community, especially those of us who invade against the invasions of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, who have some at least consistency and credibility, have got to figure out how we can reach people with the power and influence to try to stop this. And I hear the generals now, some of them today on CNN and MSNBC, talking about a no-fly zone, things that can lead to the ultimate catastrophe that we all want to avoid. Putin's nuclear threats, his missile exercises in Belarus, the things that he's been saying, again, if he is unhinged as he seems to be right now, then that makes that even more dangerous. So we've got to figure out a way to cut this off before it spills over and involves more than just Ukraine, and figure out a way to get Ukraine to accept a certain kind of neutrality, and figure out a way to make things at least bring this current stage to an end. We can figure out, and I'd like to hear what people think about what Putin's ultimate goal is, and where we as an international community need to go to create a different kind of peaceful world that provides security for everybody.
Thank you, Peter. Well, just before turning to, I see we're joined by Jeremy Kuzmarov. He's from the great state of Oklahoma. Just a couple of words, since we already mentioned several times Kennedy in American University. No, Kennedy went for compromise, and his compromise was to take nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy, and Khrushchev took missiles from Cuba, and crisis was resolved. Today and a week before, crisis could be avoided. There will be no invasion, I think. And if only one thing that Biden would compromise, just say no Ukraine into NATO. no, America has total, dominance over NATO. If Biden would say, I understand Russia's concern, and I simply, it's my compromise, my offer is that Ukraine will not be part of NATO, and the crisis would be resolved. And then other points which Russia demanded could be negotiated. But flatly, Biden and other NATO members and have refused to do it. So it's a sad story that Biden didn't go the way he is also Democratic leader. He didn't go the way Kennedy went when he agreed to make this compromise. Okay, I think we still have a few people to speak. Let's say Jeremy from Oklahoma. Let's try to be a little short. We want to have everyone to speak and then have discussion. Maybe students will come up with some questions. Jeremy, please go ahead.
Okay, sure. Well, yeah, I came on a bit late, but I heard Peter, most of what Peter was saying, and yeah, I think he had a good assessment. And yeah, I think you too, Ed, and that's not what we're not hearing in the media. I was talking to my friend the other day, like our media, yeah, for those who are in Russia, we're not seeing our media. It's as if the world started on Thursday, and there's nothing happened before. So then yeah, Putin looks like a madman, diabolical aggressor, and Russia is the bad guy, and they're constantly reinforcing Russia as the bad guy. And I mean, of course, it's more complex. If you look at the backstory, if you look at the failure of diplomacy, as you point out, I mean, it's ultimately the war could have been averted if the U.S. would have agreed to the sensible points that Putin was making about NATO expansion and just said, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. It's really pretty simple. That's all the Biden administration had to do. And to stop arming Ukraine, I mean, that's obviously a threat to Russia. And I mean, if a few made the analogy, if you poke a bear so many times, he's going to lash back. And I mean, what the U.S. has been doing for the last 8 years to provoke Russia, to provoke this conflict is really indefensible. But I think the U.S. public doesn't know about it because the media, they weren't paying attention. The media barely reported over the last 8 years, and now they're not reporting it at all. And it's meant to be this black and white story. And all of a sudden, Ukraine are heroes when it's a government that was ranked, one of the most corrupt in the world. When they're neo-Nazi, I think a lot of the frontline soldiers are, fascists or Banderites who worship, Stephen Bandera. So that story though is not told at all here in the U.S. And I think we're seeing increasing censorship of any dissenting voices, whether they're left or right. They're being ridiculed. They're being shut off the media. Again, these supposedly more left-wing or progressive political figure like Bernie Sanders are aligning with the sanctions. And the sanctions are very harsh. And actually, I have a piece coming out today. I'm just editing that I use what I think the U.S. has been plotting all along, is the Brzezinski strategy that they use with Afghanistan, induce a Russian invasion and then try and bankrupt Russia through economic sanctions, or bog them down in a quagmire. I think their calculation is that this will be a quagmire with all the weapons that the U.S. and Western countries are supplying to Ukraine, and with the nationalist sentiment in some sector of the country that they're going to resist. It's going to be a drawn-out quagmire, and this is going to bleed Russia. It's going to fuel dissent against Putin, and with the economic sanctions, because I mean, their hope is regime change. It was outlined in Iran Corporation study 2019, which is called Overextending, and the title is basically overt that they want regime change. Putin, whatever strengths or weaknesses, was not Boris Yeltsin. I mean, the U.S. interest is a weak Russia. They want to go back to the days of the 1990s where they can control Russia. Putin, since he came in 2000, the stronger leader for Russia. He's retaken control partly over the economy of Russia from the foreign interests and oligarchs under Yeltsin that had plundered it under the shock therapy. I mean, of course, Russia has many internal problems. I'm not suggesting he's a perfect leader, but compared to Yeltsin, and from the U.S. point of view, they don't like him, not because I mean he's a strong man, but Yeltsin was a strong man. I mean, Yeltsin stormed the parliament, and he was the golden boy of the West. So I mean, they have complete double standard. The main reason they oppose Putin is because he's stronger. He'll stand up to the U.S. and West. He's showing that now in Ukraine, and they have a long-term agenda of regime change. And I think they've had a plan. This is part of the plan, is to provoke them. I think they know if they provoke Russia enough, they'll react the way they're doing, and they can intensify the sanctions and advance their program of regime change. I don't think that will necessarily come about. Putin might pull back in the next couple of days. He might succeed. I can't predict what will happen, but I'm not sure that the U.S. plan will work, and it's going to cause a lot of suffering. I mean, just the sanctions have a huge ripple effect on the global economy. The inflation, the price of oil is going up. The inflation, Russia produces fertilizer, wheat. It's causing shortages or threats of shortages in numerous countries. And so there's going to be hardship around the world. And I think the people in the West need to recognize that the government of the United States is very dangerous, because they've been playing geopolitical games that has created this crisis at this time.
Okay, Jeremy, thank you so much. Before turning to Glenn in Oslo, speaking about censorship in the United States media, something what happened to me personally. I was invited to speak on National Public Radio, and for Russian students, this is the only radio station which is national, because usually radio stations in America are local. And I accepted, and then they called and said, before you put you on the air, we want to ask you a couple of questions. So they asked me a couple of questions, and I told them honestly, my opinion. And 10 minutes later, the guy who was asking me questions, great, we confirmed time, the time that I'll be on the air on this radio station. Then 10 minutes later, I get a message that unfortunately, something changed, schedule has changed, and I'm no longer invited to speak to American public, express my opinion. This is National Public Radio. It's probably most prestigious radio station, and this is how they behave. Not think very appropriate for media which calls itself democratic and allows free speech. Okay, Glenn, back to Oslo, the country of NATO, Stoltenberg. Sorry for this introduction. This is not the way, I would like to introduce you. He's, of course, professor for history and political science at the University of Oslo. Please go ahead.
Thank you. And I can empathize with your story. I've had the same in the Norwegian media, many occasions being scolded, public in the media, shamed, asked why the university doesn't fire me because apparently I'm a Russian propagandist. Even today, I was called again by the media asking if I'm willing to apologize for having written for Russian media in the past and promise I will never do it again. Failure to do so now, obviously, they will write article that I'm legitimizing war, and yes. So it's so much for the free country of Norway as well. It's very McCarthyite atmosphere here. Anyways, I just want to talk today about how I see what explains Russia's actions, but also how the West should respond or could respond. So in my opinion, I think a lot of the confusion and disagreements in terms of how to interpret Russia and how the West should respond depends on whether we consider Russia an expansionist or revisionist power or a status quo power. So again, status quo power seeks to alter the existing realities, while the status quo power seeks to hold on to its existing position by pushing back against this back against revisionists. So the failure to interpret Russia correctly, I argue, is very dangerous because it puts us on a path to nuclear war. Now, in this first hypothesis, which is very popular in the Western media and political class, is that Russia is expansionist and a revisionist power. And then its actions have to be intended to restore an empire. So we can then conclude that, again, as the media suggests, Putin may have lost his mind by starting this terrible war with so many risks ending up with a nuclear exchange. Now, if this is the case, obviously, then the best approach for NATO would be to put weapons into Ukraine, sanctions, mobilize forces along the Ukrainian border, Russian border. And the purpose would then be to alter the cost-benefit analysis of Moscow by making expansion and what's believed to be empire building as an unattractive option, and therefore motivate Russian soldiers to go home. So no more expansionism. That would be the strategy. And now that Russia signals it's putting its nuclear weapons on high alert, this can then be dismissed as nuclear blackmail, expand without opposition. And again, bowing to it is risky. However, that's the assumption that Russia is an expansionist and a revisionist power. The second option that would be that Russia is a status quo power. And again, if Russia's a status quo power, then these policies of pumping weapons into Ukraine and mobilizing along Russia and Ukrainian border will not probably continue to put us on this path of nuclear war, because Russia has no option then but to escalate as well, to push back against NATO. So let's say Russia is reacting to NATO expansion. As Russia said very consistently for 3 decades that this is the main threat to its security, and also for the past 20 years been very explicit that using NATO to organize Ukraine into the US orbit is considered to be an existential threat. So then what can be done to explain this drastic and risky and dangerous action by Russia by invading Ukraine? Again, Ukraine is seen as gradually now drifting into the US orbit. So obviously NATO membership was not on for tomorrow, but it was seen as drifting towards this direction. And the opposition leader obviously is jailed. The opposition media has been shut down, and we see support for NATO-ship going up while Donbass is shelled. And of course, the US and Kyiv have been argued to now sabotage the Minsk agreement for 7 years. So from this perspective, Moscow didn't see any diplomatic path anymore for a neutral Ukraine. None of the agreements which have been reached to pursue this path were no longer seen as being possible. So in this grave situation, states are prepared to take huge risks, which is never a good thing for stability in the international system. So what could Russia, what would the advice be to Russia in such a situation if this is deemed to be an existential threat? Well, Moscow did was obviously engage the West in diplomacy, ask for the security guarantees, demand that Ukraine will be neutral, get NATO weapons out of Ukraine, and of course take this membership off the table. And if this fails, as Russia suggested, then it would impose it by force. Now, me, like many others, believe that Russia wouldn't go to this final step, because I think Russia was achieving many of its objectives already in terms of getting negotiations started, talking about talking about Russian legitimate security interests for the first time in like 30 years. So I thought, I did not see this coming. I thought it was, if they were going to do it, this was very much premature. However, what should NATO do in this situation if Russia is a status quo power? Because to survive this, we really have to rethink European security architecture. Also given the way Russia has responded. So, as Macron also recognized, European security can't simply be organized by expanding NATO towards Russian borders and trying to destabilize Russia, regime change. So what we need is a European security agreement that also allows Russia to have security, because by denying Russia security, we also undermine our own, as we're now seeing. However, now at the height of a war, it's a very hard argument to make. So we can condemn, but if one aims to show understanding or explain Russia's motivation, then one is very easily denounced for legitimizing the invasion, not caring about Ukrainians, so effectively, to be silenced. So I think this is very dangerous, because diplomacy and compromise is now denounced as appeasement. And if we listen to our leaders in media, their political imagination appears to be limited to the only acceptable outcome is defeat of Russia. Now, how do we see this? Well, there's two things that's being proposed. Well, one, maybe we can get the Russians to topple their leader, so regime change, or just pour enough weapons into Ukraine to defeat Russians on the battleground, which probably won't happen anyways. But anyways, these are all only solutions in which the West can declare victory over Russia. There's absolutely no diplomacy anymore at the table. So, and this is very problematic, because if Russia was expansionist, it could simply pack up and go home. But if it's a status quo power, what can it do? If it pulls out of Ukraine, it will be defeat. And in this climate, NATO weaponry will pour in immediately, and it will be politically difficult in the West to even oppose Ukraine NATO membership. And also removing Putin from power, I'm not sure what that would actually do. I mean, what can any other Russian leader do that would replace Putin? I mean, I agree that maybe he's been surrounded too much long by yes men. Again, this did not seem like the pragmatic and calculative approach he usually has. And if they would pull out now, it would be seen as a capitulation, and more US weapons and soldiers would come towards its own borders, and this would then be a step towards de facto NATO membership. So again, if Russia sees this as an existential threat, it can't happen, and this is why Russia saw itself as having necessary to go a bit harder. Now, my concern now is the West doesn't have any more sanctions to play, really. The full divorce is almost complete now. Without any more common relations, without any economic ties, NATO will have to move in on military pressure. So sending more weapons into Ukraine to kill Russian soldiers. Then we see countries talking about now accepting volunteers, possibly creating incentives for sending volunteers fighters. And obviously Russia will respond by stepping up its bombing, make sure that all of this is blown up as soon as it crosses the border. And then, of course, we can assume that British and US politicians calling for no-fly zone will have more wind in their sails once this happens, which means shooting down Russian planes. And now it was in direct war with Russia. And this is obviously very problematic, because Russia would then obviously attack NATO countries in return. But if Russia would be seen as losing such a thing, obviously they would have to go to tactical nuclear weapons if the state is if the existence of the state is threatened. Then this could be a step. So this is just one step after the other towards an unthinkable situation. So in my opinion, the situation is now out of control. Political leaders and media are saying now openly this is a time for condemnation, no understanding, and the cooler heads are obviously not prevailing anymore. So just to finish, I would like to point out that Russia decided to go to war. So this decision obviously and responsibility lays at the feet of Russia. But we, that is NATO, we have to also admit that we created this situation. We created a Europe without Russia, which unavoidably became a Europe against Russia. So I ask people not to interpret this normatively as legitimizing anything. I'm just saying we have to outline the geopolitical reality here of why the pan-European security architecture has collapsed, because we can't say that this happened in a vacuum, and because then simply there's no more hope left for peace, then it's only confrontation. So so I'm very pessimistic. So yeah, we'll leave it there.
Okay, Glenn. Well, all of us, I think, don't have too much optimism those days. Well, it's Matt. We wanted to start with you. Now it's all circle. It's back to you in Montreal. So it was your idea to have this discussion this morning, and now it's your time to conclude.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I don't think it was necessary. I think this is an idea that was going to happen whether or not I poked you, Ed. This is really your forte. And I think history does require these types of discussions happen at a higher density than usual, because there is a lot of confusion, a lot of dissonance being spread into the mental landscape. I think a lot of this is intentional, especially here on the side of the Iron Curtain, the new Iron Curtain, where many of us are located. Just watching the media, I mean, as Jeremy had pointed out, you have people from all sides, left, right, people who had spent years advocating peace, calling out McCarthyism as one of the darkest periods in American history, calling out the lies that got us into Iraq that were always lies, that justified also the bombing of Afghanistan with shock and awe, targeting infrastructure, civilian water systems, energy, museums, all of these things, including Libya and Syria. I mean, there's so many people who had did commendable things by speaking up and speaking out against such insane, unjustified, immoral actions that have killed so many lives unjustly, and yet who are now, with the entire buzz and hysteria, falling completely in line with CIA talking points about what's really going on and what the narrative framing is. It's a bit concerning, to say the least. And indeed, there are a lot of echoes of that old McCarthyite Cold War hysteria, where if you are even asking to talk about context, as if this, like Glenn and Jeremy and Anton and others pointed out, as if this didn't just arise in a vacuum, as if Putin didn't just like emerge out of a primordial soup a few weeks ago, but there's this longer history of intention from the Wolfowitz doctrine, which clearly in 1992 outlined the same time that George Bush Sr. was calling for, the New World Order is here to stay at the end of the Soviet Union. The Wolfowitz doctrine was basically making it clear that the rise of a Russia-China, especially Russia-China alliance, would be seen as completely incompatible with US interests, which was re-amplified by Zbigniew Brzezinski throughout the 1990s in his grand chessboard as one of the greatest fears, that especially a Russia-China-Iran collaboration would be one of the greatest threats to the perceived US hegemony that was outlined in the Project for a New American Century, that terrible, terrible manifesto, which ran roughshod over so many nations over the past 20 years. So we are now in a situation where I believe Douglas McGregor made a very good point that the US should stop shipping weapons to encourage Ukrainians to die in a hopeless endeavor. All of these different experts all agree that the Ukrainians don't have the military power to actually defeat the Russians, but yet they're applauding so much the arming of civilians who don't really fully know what's going on half the time, who are not trained to use heavy artillery, yet they're being armed by influxes of in many cases, untraceable weapons. They don't know how to use them against very well-trained Russian soldiers. You have prisoners being freed in Ukraine. I mean, I'm just reading a report right now who are willing to fight the Russians. And you also have, in case of Kiev, I speak to journalists, friends of mine, who have made a point that many of these more virulent right sector affiliated Azov-smelling battalions, who are endemic across the landscape as these paramilitary groups, they're establishing basing operations in residential buildings. Missile systems are being built up inside of and near residential buildings, making it very hard to avoid civilian casualties. So Russia, one of the things that's very different is that they did, I've seen many cases of, since Minsk II, which Putin and the Russians played a very big role organizing the Minsk II agreements. I think everyone knows what that is. That was disobeyed again and again. Nobody honored it in Kiev. That would have avoided this condition that we're in right now. There's always a demand to absorb Ukraine into NATO, as if Ukraine was its own sovereign entity, and as if people like Biden had not gone public, celebrating the fact that he withheld $1 billion of loans so that the Ukrainian government would fire their prosecutor general who was investigating Burisma criminal dealings. Or as if Victoria Nuland herself didn't brag that the U.S. put $5 billion into operations to restructure Ukraine, leading up to the Maidan. And again, Oliver Stone's documentary, Ukraine on Fire, I just reviewed it, is a wonderful thing for anybody who's confused about this. Watch Ukraine on Fire by Oliver Stone. Very good overview. So, Minsk II could have happened. You could have given the type of status to the Lugansk and Donetsk regions as Crimea had enjoyed for a long time. That wasn't honored. The simple agreement to not advance NATO onto Russia's border and install military systems, as has been the case for now quite some time. This could have been avoided. And so we have instead, I think, something which is important. Russia is not attacking civilian infrastructure. We have, again, people, journalists who are uploading onto the internet videos and reporting from Kiev, from all over Ukraine. The electricity systems have not been destroyed. The water systems have not been destroyed. And in fact, in the case of Crimea, the 85% of the water that had been withheld since 2015 by Kiev has been opened up now. So there's actually humanitarian relief being provided, which has been desperate. People have been choked off in Crimea for lack of water. There have been a lot of cases, again, of Azov and right sector and other neo-Nazi affiliates all over the place. The Canadian Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland here, whose grandfather was Mikhail Chomiak, the person who was a direct Hitler collaborator running one of the biggest newspapers in Ukraine, calling for the roundup of Jews and Poles in the case of World War II. This is our Deputy Prime Minister's grandfather, who she honors. She has just been caught holding a right-wing nationalist black and red Ukrainian flag just yesterday morning at a march in solidarity with Ukrainians. You have the battalions, an international legion being set up to recruit people from Canada, from the US, willing to fight. I don't know how they're going to get them into Ukraine, but that's the plan right now. You can sign up at any Ukrainian embassy and then be sent off, given a weapon that you've never been taught how to use, to go and fight Russians. Russia is doing things very different. They have not exhibited any type of imperial ambitions in the case of the last 20 years. I haven't seen it, 30 years even. And what I think this plays into is the China-Russia manifesto, which just a few weeks ago was made public for a new era of cooperation. It was like a manifesto, a constitution for a new economic order based on also a new security system that honors the UN Charter, that honors the protection of sovereign nation states, to work together with win-win cooperation. It's a beautiful program. And I think that sort of thing scares the hell out of those who kind of know they have a lot to hide. I mean, we have institutions running in the West, and I'll end it right now, who have, over the past 70 years, the tradition of things like utilizing Nazis from the standpoint, and I don't want to overuse the term, but I mean, it's true. Rainer Gellin was installed as the head of Western German intelligence by Allen Dulles and the CIA as part of a broader project to combat the Soviets in the 1950s. And this is the person who was the head of Nazi Hitler's intelligence agencies. He was working very closely with Stefan Bandera, who was installed in German intelligence by the same CIA and Western Anglo-American intelligence networks. This is the thing that sprang Operation Gladio, that utilized and weaponized Nazi stay-behinds all over Europe to carry out assassinations of people like Enrico Mattei, Aldo Moro, various terrorist activities, which is very much, I think, tied to the emergence of this neo-Nazi plague, second, third generation neo-Nazis who have been weaponized and brainwashed by a false idea of history and are utilized. And I mean, those who have utilized and weaponized these groups have a lot, again, to hide. And I think that now is the time where, and I'll just end it right now, that the shadow creatures are being forced out of the shadows. Everything has been operating in backroom secret diplomacy and illusions. And now finally, Putin has forced, I think, a lot of this to the surface by just simply laying out clear red lines, by simply saying that there's not going to be a toleration of this type of expansion of NATO with full spectrum encirclements of Russia, or with China. China's facing the same thing in the Pacific. The CIA has put out their own, the CFR has put out their own programs that Biden has announced, calling for China to be encircled and their environment to be destabilized. Taiwan's sort of the Ukraine of Pacific, and it's all part of one program. So I think we're in a very different world right now. I did not expect this to happen. I don't think many people did forecast this correctly, but I think it's important to keep this history and context in mind when evaluating just the types of things that are cropping up day to day.
Thank you, Matt. Well, let's see. Anyone wants to add a few words, but try to be very short.
Yeah.
Because we still won't have students maybe say or ask some questions. Anton, go ahead. But
Yeah, just very briefly,
right.
I want to challenge everybody here to look at the United States as what it has been in history, a blessing to the world. And the present situation of the United States acting as a menace to the world comes from a change that put the United States under an establishment that is not the United States historically. It has its own interests, and it is out at this point to ruin the entire civilization that the West gained since the Renaissance and since the American Revolution. I just point to Lincoln. What did Lincoln do when for 30 years, the Southern slave owners were more and more aggressive, making foreign wars from the US against Mexico, against Cuba? Then they turned on the USA. So in response to that, when Lincoln came to be president, he was prepared not simply to fight this reactionary and dangerous enemy, but he was prepared to shift the United States into a completely new era that had never been seen before of progress, of higher living standards, of industrial and scientific progress, of beautiful relations with the other countries in the world, Japan, Germany, Russia, China. We were reaching out to everyone to say, we're going to make the world so surprisingly better that that can never be rolled back again. So my challenge to people today is that you must address this change in America, which is against US interests, certainly against the people of the United States, against the minorities and everybody else in the United States. We have to resume America's fight for progress. And that means that we face censorship and bullying whenever, as you've pointed out, whenever you are trying to use reason. I would say, rather than apologizing for anything, we have to address ourselves to the question, how do we appeal to the American people? Not by rhetoric as a leftist may do in the streets about American claws and fangs. We've got to address what is the United States, how it has been changed by these usurpers who are a menace to the world. Unless you address America and appeal to their better angels, you've lost. You have to do that. Russia and everybody else, I think, should do that, but especially Americans and those who know something about a beautiful America of the past must challenge America to not betray this heritage, which is so valuable to the world.
Thank you, Anton. You know, in case you didn't know that, there's a statue of Abraham Lincoln and Russian Tsar Alexander II, who also freed Russian slaves at the same time. And there's a statue in downtown Moscow, in one of the most prestigious area called Arbat. It's equivalent to maybe Washington, Georgetown. And so they're shaking hands in downtown Moscow. It's very symbolic. Okay, anyone else? Yes, Herb, Liz, yes. By the way, Herb, he is Catholic University of America, has direct links to the Pope. And I asked Herb to see if he can message to the Pope to say something. And let's see, maybe Herb will tell us some news.
Well, in reference to that point, the Pope has already scheduled meetings with the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. So that will happen shortly before Easter. And a part of that discussion will be the Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
Good,
Um,
good.
There is a lot of back channeling going on. Not to forget that Vladimir Putin is a member of the Russian Orthodox Church, as Putin, as the President of the United States, is also part of the flock of the Roman Catholic Church. But I admire what was just said by Anton, that this is very important, that we don't lose what America is about in terms of its heritage and what it can contribute. And it's always a challenge in a democracy, because we have the opportunity, we have the rights, and we need to organize ourselves, as we do when it comes to existential climate change issues, where an invested amount of traditional thinking is revolutionary, being confronted, that they need to cooperate. Confrontation, cooperation is the element. The problem is the narrative. So I'll just take one example. Glenn, you speak about the status. I concur in your book that you wrote that on conservatism in Russia is a domestic issue. But do not, in my opinion, make that fault line continue for foreign policy. For foreign policy is the reestablishment of Putin's vision. He wouldn't be in Syria. He wouldn't be in Libya. He would not have the Wagner groups in Africa, oil-rich countries. He would not be expanding in those areas to reestablish, I am back at the table. And I don't think it's the Eastern Europe, the eastward expansion that Russia wants. Russia wants respect. And that's an important part of why there's that expansionism. It's about being accepted as a player at the table. And that is the biggest part about cooperation instead of confrontation. And when you look at NATO, with 30 different cultures and history and geography, the underlying element for that defensive or whatever you may interpret it, but it is an organization that works on the understanding of respect of each other's culture and each other's history. And if that understanding is expanded to deal with other forms of government, then it is our fundamental values as a democracy in a free country to tolerate each other. For that is the problems we have domestically when we turn to racism.
Okay, well,
Can I just respond very quickly?
sure.
Sorry. No, I agree with Herbert, of course, with the respect aspect, that this is a key issue, but I still think that at the heart of all this, it remains, again, as been for the past 30 years, the issue of NATO expanding. Now, when I use the term of status quo versus revisionist, I would say that so far Russia has acted as a status quo power. I mean, we use almost all examples of military force as an example of revisionism. However, you can use military power both for expansion, revisionism, or status quo. So again, with the example of Syria, this is something. This is well, one can disagree with what Russia did, but it was after the West worked towards toppling Assad in Syria that Russia intervened in 2015. So backing up a government it already had a partnership with. So again, saving that government, well, one can argue, you know, if it's moral or anything else, but it is the definition of a status quo power. And again, I think this is what's always been the case, because Russia also used, of course, force in 2008 with Georgia. But again, this was Georgia was trying to take over South Ossetia. Russia intervened. They didn't try to conquer all of Georgia. They didn't incorporate it into some new Soviet empire. They pushed them out of South Ossetia and held on to their existing position. Again, one can refer to international law and anything, but this is the action of a status quo power. So I think, even Crimea, this is they held on to their existing base there. They could have taken in 2014. Ukraine was much weaker. They could have overwhelmed more cities easier than now, of course. But my point is, this is the actions of status quo power, holding on to what is threatened by what's others' expansionist or revisionist powers. So I think I would still define Russia as a status quo power. However, this invasion of Ukraine now, obviously, could even make this discussion maybe a lot more difficult because it's such a huge scale. But it still could fit within this narrative or this idea that Russia seeks to hold its existing position. That is the neutrality of Ukraine as it was until 2014, when it had this legal commitment to remain neutral. Sorry, I'll just leave it there.
Okay. Well, I think it's very good discussion. Students could see that we have different opinions. We still have, at least in the university community, we can still express our opinions. We are probably censored in the media, and not universally. I still am allowed to print my point of view in Washington Times. And Washington Times, it's a kind of a leading newspaper for the Republican Party. And actually, I now finishing this article about what's going on. And it's interesting for me to speak to all of you and students especially, that we are now, it's a really very important and I would say very dangerous time. More and more we hear about nuclear. And one thing is to study nuclear physics. Another thing is to have this horrible thing, nuclear war. And when this was Senator Sam Nunn, he was probably the first who coined the term sleepwalking into nuclear catastrophe. Senator Sam Nunn was a very powerful man. I mean, he was, I think, head of the Armed Services Committee and, very respected senator. And he's still around, by the way. And other experts, use the same term, sleepwalking into nuclear catastrophe. So what question is, what can we do? We are university people, political scientists, students. I think that I, at the end, wanted to bring one idea, and it may sound like naive, but probably not. I'm by education, I'm actually a nuclear physicist, definitely not a composer, but I did finish musical school and I played a little bit like piano and all that. So all this what's going on inspired me to write a little waltz, peace waltz, and then asking many people, including you and maybe some prominent, famous musicians, artists, poets, scientists, to express maybe just 1-2 words toward peace. You understand, after we play, Glenn, as soon as I finish, you will play it. It's very short, it's a couple of minutes, but idea is that this music, I call it waltz for peace. The reason I used waltz because on April 25, 1945, Russia and the United States, we were allies. And we met at the Elbe River in Germany. And this was like a symbolic act that World War II comes to the end. And it was really camaraderie, Russians and Americans embracing each other, drinking and dancing waltz. So I composed this little waltz and we show different videos. It's only starting point. It has to be saturated with statements, maybe with kind of pictures, additional pictures, but the theme is a call for peace. I'm grateful to Matt. Matt actually used this music and he transformed it into a video, which you're going to see now. And what I'm asking all of you, and especially my students, to come up with some ideas. No, it's not young people. Listen, it's your generation. You're just entering your life, and if, God forbid, we have nuclear war, then no one knows what's going to happen with our beautiful planet. So please, just don't take this as simply as a like home assignment. Think about this more like saving the world and you and your families. But we need more ideas how to transform this 2 minutes into something more bigger than that. Okay, Glenn, go ahead. Let's finish this on a more kind of optimistic note.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let me know if it's shared now, right?
Yeah, we can see it.
Right, good. The music will start in a second.
Glenn, I believe that when you did the share screen, you had to select the option share sound as well. So do stop screen share.
Stop screen share. I apologize.
That's fine.
Yeah, stop share.
Yeah, now do share again, but this time click up the bottom left hand. There should be an option saying share audio or something to that effect.
Share sound.
And just click
Yeah.
share sound. That's it. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Okay, hope it works now.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Beautiful.
So again, this is just a starting point. This music was also recorded by a symphony orchestra, and so we're now working. Actually, Matt is working to combine this. What you heard was electronic. Unfortunately, sound was not so good, maybe over the Zoom, but I will send all of you the real link, which quality is much better. But as soon as Matt finishes adding classical orchestra and some other pictures, we will ask I'll start sending it out, put on Facebook and all over, and then tell people how we can expand it, this music, transform into something more like a call for peace, and see how it works. It's at this point, it's the best thing I can do, plus of course writing my articles. And but maybe some of you have other ideas, so please don't just abandon and don't lose optimism. We still probably can save this world. It's too beautiful to lose.
That's right.
Thank you.
Well said, Ed. And still don't know how you ended up getting an actual symphony orchestra. That was an incredible accomplishment you did. If any of the students as well, a lot of material has been thrown out by the various speakers today. And if any of the students have questions regarding any of these elements, now's a great time to throw your question out there.
What we can do is, so we don't really overextend, I will send, if you don't mind, your emails to my students.
Sure.
And they'll be able to simply ask you questions directly. And I hope you find time to respond. I always, by the way, students can confirm it. When they ask me something, I always respond back, but it's my job. So I have to do it. But hopefully you will find also a few minutes to respond. So I really urge students to, after you listen this, come up with some question, maybe ideas. I really count on your ideas about this music, because in the past, in the old days, sometimes politicians failed, then what we call people's diplomacy failed or helped. So maybe this will be our people's diplomacy, which can contribute to this cause.
Before we go, could we maybe hear from the students about how the war is being covered, or what are the feelings in Russia right now?
Anyone from students? Okay, don't be shy, please.
Because we only get our side of the media. It'd be interesting to see for us in North America how the Russian media is covering it, to hear.
By the way, they tell me, they writing to me, some of them agree with me, some disagree. It's a very good discussion. I think that now it's maybe shy, unless someone will raise a hand, but they will definitely respond in writing. Last call. Anyone? It's your choice. It's your moment to, be part of this discussion live. Anyone? Come on.
Well, the only thing I can tell you is that everything is really very complicated. We actually don't know who to believe, which mass media we can believe. So, yeah.
Well,
And are they presenting Russia as winning the war, or because in the Russian state media, at least?
Well, honestly, I cannot completely answer your question, because I have a pretty much, for now, it's a bad habit of not following the news tightly. But from what I could gather, is that for the most part, the titles of the news that we are hearing or seeing is something like Zelensky said that, Ukrainian news claimed the other thing or the same thing. So I believe for us, it's more like not our actions, but but how the others perceive us, like what the comments that the Western news made, or what Ukrainian news said. For us, it's for the most part like that. But what really astonishes me is how seemingly nothing changed after the war has been declared, because well, the very same morning when this war was declared, nothing really changed. We are in a state of war right now, but it's not really covered and not proclaimed to the extent that seemingly nothing has changed. Well, some people may discuss it inter se, but it's not even the biggest talk right now. Although those who are involved in the political life, or just probably every citizen is against war if you ask them. But it's really surprising how nobody noticed that.
Interesting.
I hope that answers your question. Because as I said, I don't really follow news.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay, well, actually,
And also,
oh, yeah,
I would
go
like
ahead.
to say that I don't know about others, but personally, I'm really scared about the current situation in the world. And thank you for your opinions. It was really important to know, personally for me, that there are lots of other opinions, not only blaming Russians in all bad things in the world. So thank you very much for your debates.
Okay,
Thank you.
we're good. But we will continue, definitely will continue discussions. Now we have this group of Americans who are ready to respond. They join us today from different parts of the country. I want to thank all speakers today, and let's do what we can. Okay.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thanks for organizing this. Thank you, Ed and Matt.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.